Everyone knows the Alamo. 188 heroes defying impossible odds for liberty. But what if that's the biggest lie in American history? What if the real story isn't courage alone? It's slavery's iron grip, fatal leadership chaos, and a fortress doomed before the cannons fired? Today we rip apart every myth and expose the brutal truth that changed everything. The unchecked arrival of Anglo settlers in Mexican Texas was not merely an expansion of American frontier ambition, but a deliberate, calculated invasion of a foreign legal order, one doomed by the settlers' refusal to accept any constraint on their slave-based economic vision. Driven by the explosive profitability of cotton in the 1820s and early 1830s, these migrants viewed Texas less as Mexican soil than as an extension of the U.S. Deep South's plantation system. They openly flouted Mexico's two core requirements, Catholic conversion and formal naturalization, because both clashed with their Protestant identity and their desire to retain maximum autonomy while securing land grants. Far more explosive, however, was their systematic violation of Mexico's 1829 Emancipation Decree. Thousands of enslaved African Americans were carried across the border and held in bondage despite repeated Mexican prohibitions and clarifications. This was no oversight. Planters regarded slavery as non-negotiable to their economic survival and social hierarchy. They employed legal fictions, calling enslaved people indentured servants on paper, and outright defiance to preserve the institution that fueled their wealth. A common oversimplification holds that the Texas conflict arose primarily from cultural or religious differences between Protestant settlers and Catholic Mexico. In reality, while those tensions existed, the central and irreconcilable fracture was slavery itself. Mexico's repeated, increasingly forceful attempts to eradicate it collided head-on with the settlers' determination to transplant and expand the plantation economy, making peaceful coexistence structurally impossible from the outset. The shift from federalism to centralism in 1835 Mexico was not simply a bureaucratic reorganization. It represented a desperate conservative counter-revolution against chronic instability. Yet it fatally alienated peripheral regions like Texas by stripping away the very autonomies that had lured settlers in the first place. Mexico's original 1824 federal constitution, deliberately modeled on the U.S. system to accommodate vast and diverse territories, had promised states, including Coahuila y Tejas, significant self-governance. But by the mid-1830s, mounting fiscal collapse, regional revolts, and fears of fragmentation pushed conservative elites, backed by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna after his opportunistic pivot, to dismantle that framework. The 1835 Siete Leyes replaced state legislatures with appointed departmental governors, centralized taxation and military control, and signaled aggressive enforcement of national laws, including tariffs, immigration quotas, and the long-ignored ban on slavery. For Anglo settlers already operating illegally beyond their impresario grants and dependent on enslaved labor, this centralization felt like an existential threat. Their undocumented status, untaxed trade, and human property were now directly targeted by a government no longer willing to tolerate frontier lawlessness. Settler rebellions erupted not from abstract love of federalism, but from raw self-preservation. Their entire economic model, cotton monoculture sustained by slavery, and speculative land claims depended on evading Mexican authority. Mexican officials, in turn, accurately diagnosed the unrest as the predictable consequence of unchecked illegal immigration from the United States, where thousands had entered without naturalization or conversion, treating Texas as an extension of American territory rather than sovereign Mexican land. A persistent myth claims that Texas rebels were principled defenders of Republican federalism against Santa Anna's dictatorship. In truth, while many waved the 1824 Constitution as a rallying symbol, their core motivation was far narrower and more material, preserving slavery and evading centralized regulation. Evidence lies in their initial 1835 declarations, insisting they fought only to restore the old federal system. Yet once independence was secured, they immediately established a slaveholding republic that barred free black people and enshrined slavery in its 1836 Constitution, exposing the selective invocation of Mexican Republican ideals. The "come and take it" cannon at Gonzales was far more than a symbolic provocation. It marked the precise moment when latent settler defiance crystallized into armed rebellion, transforming scattered acts of noncompliance into a coordinated challenge that Mexican authorities could no longer contain or dismiss as mere frontier unrest. The 6-pound cannon, originally issued to Green DeWitt's colony in 1831 as legitimate frontier defense against Comanche and other indigenous raids, had become by 1835 a potent emblem of settler autonomy. When Colonel Domingo de Ugartechea demanded its return, triggered by reports of DeWitt's associates attending the consultation meetings that openly questioned centralist authority, he expected compliance from settlers still nominally under Mexican law. Instead, the colonists' swift refusal exposed the depth of their alienation. They no longer viewed themselves as subjects obligated to surrender arms to a distant, increasingly intrusive government. Raising the now famous flag, "Come and take it," was a calculated act of political theater, signaling that any attempt to enforce centralist edicts would meet organized armed resistance. Within days, their numbers swelled beyond 160, enabling a dawn assault on October 2nd that routed Ugartechea's small detachment with minimal casualties and sent the Mexican force retreating toward San Antonio. This skirmish ignited the revolution not because of the cannon's military value, it was a single, outdated piece, but because it forced both sides into irreversible positions. Settlers publicly declared they would defend their de facto independence by force, while Mexican commanders recognized that persuasion had failed and coercion would now require substantial troop commitments. A widespread misconception portrays the Battle of Gonzales as a spontaneous, almost accidental uprising sparked by patriotic fervor over a single artillery piece. In reality, the confrontation was the foreseeable culmination of years of deliberate lawbreaking, illegal retention of enslaved people, unauthorized expansion beyond granted boundaries, and participation in proto-revolutionary assemblies, making the settlers' armed stand a logical, not surprising escalation of their long-standing rejection of Mexican sovereignty. The Alamo's transformation from mission to makeshift fortress was less a story of heroic preparation than a glaring example of strategic improvisation, born of desperation, dooming its defenders to fight from a position engineered for entirely the wrong kind of war. Originally Mission San Antonio de Valero, the compound had been founded in the early 18th century to convert and control local indigenous populations through agriculture, education, and religious authority. By the 1790s, secularization had reduced it to a decaying shell. Only in the 1830s, amid escalating Anglo-Mexican tensions, did Mexican troops under Colonel Domingo de Ugartechea and later General Martin Perfecto de Cos convert the sprawling, adobe-walled mission into a provisional military post. This repurposing was reactive, driven by the need to anchor control over San Antonio de Béchar against growing Texian unrest, not by any deliberate plan to withstand a prolonged siege. The resulting defenses, thick but uneven walls, a few cannon emplacements, and rudimentary elevated platforms, known as banquettes, were adequate against the hit-and-run raids of Comanche or Apache horsemen that had plagued earlier missions. They were catastrophically inadequate, however, against the disciplined artillery and infantry assaults Santa Anna would unleash in 1836. Lacking proper loopholes or embrasures, defenders had to expose themselves atop the walls to fire outward, turning every volley into a lethal gamble. The absence of covered firing positions compounded the vulnerability of an already sprawling, irregularly shaped perimeter that demanded far more men to hold than the Texians could muster. Mexican commanders understood these limitations perfectly well. Cos had fortified the Alamo in 1835 precisely because its thick walls offered some shelter against small arms fire and cavalry charges. But Santa Anna's decision to besiege rather than bypass it reflected political calculation more than military necessity. Capturing the symbolic stronghold would crush Texian morale and demonstrate centralist authority. A common myth insists the Alamo was a formidable, purpose-built fortress whose heroic defense was undone only by overwhelming Mexican numbers. In truth, its defenders inherited a religious compound poorly adapted for siege warfare, with no engineer's plan, insufficient artillery, and structural features that actively invited casualties. The prolonged stand succeeded as a delaying action and propaganda victory precisely because the site's tactical weaknesses forced Santa Anna into a costly, time-consuming assault he could ill afford, turning a military blunder into a political legend. The Alamo's command crisis in early 1836 was not mere personal squabbling. It exposed the Texian army's fatal structural weakness, a volunteer force chronically undermined by individualism, desertion, and the absence of enforceable military discipline, dooming any hope of mounting a coherent defense against a professional Mexican army. After Gonzales, most of the hastily assembled militia melted away, returning to farms and families once the immediate threat receded, unprepared for sustained campaigning and lacking food, ammunition, or pay. The garrison shrank to under 200 men by late 1835, far too few to hold the sprawling, poorly fortified mission against determined assault. Sam Houston, recognizing the Alamo's precarious position, appointed James Neal as commander in December, only for Neal to abandon the post in February 1836, citing family illness, a move emblematic of how personal obligations routinely trumped military duty among Texian volunteers. Leadership defaulted to William Barrett Travis, a young, ambitious regular officer whose rigid notions of hierarchy and discipline clashed with the rough egalitarianism of the frontier fighters. When Travis assumed command, resentment boiled over. Many men preferred James Bowie, whose legendary knife-fighting exploits and reputation for raw courage made him seem the natural leader in a scrap. Bowie won a soldier's vote, but promptly undermined his own authority by getting drunk and creating chaos in camp, an act that revealed the deeper problem of charismatic figures who lacked the temperament or training for sustained command. The eventual compromise, joint leadership between Travis and Bowie, was no real solution. It merely papered over irreconcilable differences in style and strategy, while leaving the garrison divided at the moment unity was most critical. A common myth cast the Alamo's leadership as a harmonious partnership of complementary heroes, with Travis providing discipline and Bowie supplying frontier grit. In reality, the arrangement was a fragile, resentment-filled truce born of necessity rather than mutual respect. Bowie's alcoholism and erratic behavior, combined with Travis's unpopularity among volunteers, ensured that the defenders entered the siege factionalized and leaderless in practice, conditions that amplified every tactical disadvantage of the inadequate fortress itself. Santa Anna's march on the Alamo was driven by more than battlefield logic. It was a furious personal assertion of sovereignty against what he saw as an existential humiliation. Foreign invaders who had mocked Mexican law, clung to slavery, and now openly challenged the integrity of the young republic he had fought to unify. To Santa Anna, the Texian rebels were neither legitimate settlers nor principled Republicans, but lawless squatters who had exploited Mexico's earlier generosity, ignored conversion and citizenship requirements, preserved an outlawed institution, and finally taken up arms to carve out an independent slaveholding state. His demand for unconditional surrender, followed by the explicit no-quarter policy, stemmed from this view. Mercy would only embolden further separatism across Mexico's vulnerable northern frontier. He made this stance unambiguous in a private dispatch to Andrew Jackson, framing the conflict as a defense against American filibusters rather than a civil war. Yet the letter's limited circulation meant U.S. volunteers continued streaming in, unaware that capture would likely mean execution, a failure of diplomacy that prolonged the illusion of possible negotiation. At the Alamo, commanders Travis and Bowie faced a grim calculus they could not escape. Supplies were dwindling, the garrison remained under 200 effective fighters, and the sprawling mission's walls offered little protection against professional siege tactics. James Neal's earlier plea for reinforcements had already been rebuffed by Sam Houston, who correctly judged that no sizable force could reach Bexar in time without exposing the rest of Texas to Santa Anna's advance. Houston instead ordered Bowie to destroy the artillery and abandon the post, recognizing it as indefensible. Bowie, however, defied that directive upon arrival. Lacking draft animals to move the heavy guns and convinced the Alamo could serve as a rallying point, he appealed directly to the fractured provisional government for men and material, only to receive nothing amid its own paralysis and infighting. The decision to hold reflected not strategic brilliance, but a catastrophic misreading of Santa Anna's speed and resolve. Mexican forces, marching with ruthless efficiency through winter terrain, arrived far sooner than the Texians anticipated, trapping the defenders in a siege they could neither win nor escape. A persistent myth claims Santa Anna's refusal to offer quarter at the Alamo was an act of gratuitous cruelty that needlessly inflamed Texian resistance. In truth, the policy flowed logically from his perception of the rebels as foreign invaders rather than domestic insurgents. Executing them served as both punishment and deterrent, consistent with 19th century military practice against filibusters and traitors. The no-quarter order, though brutal, was not exceptional for the era and aligned precisely with the political stakes Santa Anna believed were at stake. The siege of the Alamo that began February 23, 1836, was never a fair contest of arms. It was the inevitable collision of a professional army enforcing national sovereignty against a tiny, fractious band of volunteers whose defiance rested on nothing more substantial than bravado, desperation, and a shared refusal to abandon their slave-holding dream of independence. As Santa Anna's vanguard approached, panic swept San Antonio de Bechar. Civilians fled in droves, leaving the town eerily empty except for the 188 men barricaded in the mission compound. Travis, still clinging to some hope of reinforcement, posted a lookout in the bell tower of San Fernando Church, but the warning came too late and changed nothing. The defenders were already trapped. Santa Anna's entry with roughly 1,500 disciplined troops underscored the grotesque mismatch. His force, though not enormous by later standards, was battle-hardened, supplied, and backed by artillery, while the Alamo garrison consisted largely of untrained civilians and adventurers, short on powder, shot, food, and medicine for any extended stand. The raising of the red flag atop a church tower, Mexico's traditional signal of no quarter, crystallized the stakes: surrender or death. Rather than negotiate or withdraw, Travis responded with a cannon shot, a gesture of pure psychological defiance that committed the defenders to a fight they could not win militarily. Internal divisions nearly unraveled even that resolve. Bowie, appalled by what he saw as needless provocation, sent an envoy seeking terms. Travis, furious at the breach of command, countered with his own messenger. Mexican officers rebuffed both, reiterating unconditional surrender as the only option. The dual humiliation finally forced reconciliation. Bowie and Travis, having exhausted their separate posturing, jointly ordered another cannon blast in unison, a symbolic act that buried their rivalry beneath shared fatalism and sealed the garrison's fate. A widespread myth romanticizes the Alamo defenders' cannon fire as a unified, heroic declaration of victory or death from the outset. In reality, the opening shots exposed deep fractures, Travis's impulsiveness clashing with Bowie's pragmatism, until Mexican intransigence compelled unity not through inspiration, but through the elimination of any alternative. The joint defiance was less a stirring moment of solidarity than a last, grudging alignment before inevitable destruction. By February 24th, the siege's second day, James Bowie, whose reputation had briefly unified the garrison, was already incapacitated by a severe, undiagnosed illness, likely tuberculosis or pneumonia worsened by chronic alcoholism and old injuries. The garrison's doctors could do nothing effective. Bowie remained bedridden and semi-conscious in a small room. Attempts to display him to the men for morale only worsened the volunteers' dread, exposing their once formidable commander as helpless and gasping. As Mexican forces tightened their grip, Bowie formally yielded command to William Travis on February 26th. He died in his cot during the final assault on March 6th, along with every other combatant. Mexican troops under no-quarter orders killed all 188 defenders, but spared the non-combatants, women, children, and a few enslaved people. Conservative estimates suggest the defenders inflicted 400 to 600 casualties on Santa Anna's 1,800 to 2,400 man force through accurate rifle fire and limited cannon from cover, a heavy price that delayed the Mexican advance by 13 days, giving Sam Houston critical time to organize his army. More importantly, the slaughter forged the slogan, "Remember the Alamo," turning despair into resolve and fueling the decisive victory at San Jacinto. Bowie's illness is often dismissed as a minor setback that simply removed one leader. In truth, it was devastating. It destroyed the fragile unity he had created, left the distrustful garrison under Travis alone, and stripped the defense of vital morale precisely when it was most needed, ensuring the Alamo's stand became far more powerful in memory than it was in execution.